Hello, today is Friday, March 7th, and welcome to episode 423 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast to get you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America and arguably the world. I'm NSI Deputy Executive Director Martha Miller, and I'm joined today by NSI Advisory Board Member Lester Munson and my favorite fellows, Morgan Vina and Jessica Jones. So let's get to it here. The U.S. decision to suspend military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine has shaken the transatlantic alliance, some people might say to its core, with European leaders scrambling to respond. The shift came just days after a kerfuffle in the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. It was a meeting that was so contentious that incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz described it as not a spontaneous reaction, but obviously a deliberate escalation. The White House has not explicitly framed the aid and intelligence suspension as part of a pressure campaign, but that's how European officials and many analysts have been interpreting it. Some see the pause as leverage to push Ukraine toward engaging in U.S.-led peace talks that could require Kyiv to consider territorial concessions, and others believe it's simply an effort to force European nations to take on greater financial and military responsibility for Europe. So here we are. Secretary Hegseth met with the British Defense Secretary Healey. We have had numerous meetings in Europe with heads of state. Where does this put us now? Morgan, let's start with you. What are the implications of this pause of intelligence sharing?
Thanks. So, Martha, by limiting U.S. support, President Trump is really removing Ukraine's capabilities to defend themselves against Russia. And by doing so, he's forcing Ukraine into accepting peace negotiations that, quite frankly, do not advantage Kyiv or the Ukrainian people, for that matter. Look, I get that Europeans are fearing that the United States is stepping away from support to Ukraine and leaving them vulnerable. President Macron of France highlighted this in his speech to the nation. But look, I mean, right now, the Europeans are wringing their hands and trying to figure out how they're going to defend themselves. To be clear, they should have been preparing for this moment, decades ago, right? Or at least 3 years ago when Ukraine was invaded by Russia. It's no secret that Russia violates the sovereignty of European nations. And all the while, the Europeans have relied on the United States to have their back. And so while I personally feel that the United States should remain steadfast in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression, the Europeans have really dropped the ball on this, and now I fear it's a little too late.
Jess, Macron's nuclear umbrella proposal, how big a signal is this, that Europe no longer trusts U.S. security guarantees?
I mean, I think it shows that they're scrambling to figure out what they can do quickly, both in the immediate term and in the long term, right? They have an immediate pressing issue, which is how to continue support for Ukraine, how to redirect resources to bolster their own national armies, how to up manufacturing, what they can do, how they can try to come up with a coherent defense spending, which is not done at an EU level, right? It's done at a nation state level. And so they're throwing everything at the table, including discussing nuclear deterrence. France is the only member of the EU that has nuclear weapons. And you see some Baltic states, you have Poland interested, saying that they would be interested in that topic. Germany talking also about, that third rail, also discuss, maybe showing some interest there. So it potentially could be a bigger issue. I know there's maybe some disagreement on the show or whether that is a serious issue. And so we're starting, to Morgan's point, this is long due. The European leaders should have been thinking about this. During the first Trump administration, they heard about their defense spending not being enough. And I'll just put it in air quotes, threats to America's, to NATO. So they should have known this was coming. They should have been planning for this a long time ago. And I think they're now thinking about like the worst case scenario. What if the U.S. announces some kind of deal that they disagree with, that gives into a lot of Russian demands? Do they take it or leave it? So I think they're trying to think of how do they bolster their own position and what might be a negotiation table later, and trying to seem united. I do think it's interesting what will be the secondary effects if Europe in the long term starts to think of its future not with the U.S. cornerstone when it comes to its defense spending, when it comes to manufacturing. And I love the phrase that's been bandied about, like, make Europe great again. And that might be the unintended consequence of them actually hopefully coming out with, coherent policies and moving as a bloc moving forward.
So we're looking at not MAGA, but mega. And
maybe, exactly. Pick whatever European language you might need to say that in.
Lester, what are your thoughts? Are there some possible, positive unintended consequences that could come of this?
Yes. Yes, Martha. Would you like to know more?
Done.
To know what they are, if they exist.
Yeah,
is there a silver lining?
Is there a silver lining? Well, I do think it's interesting that the kerfuffle in the Oval a week ago, subject of much commentary, consternation, etc., has actually given our allied governments something to push back against. Canada, European leaders are suddenly more popular than they were before. This includes Volodymyr Zelensky, whose popularity in Ukraine was not terrific. He's getting, by pushing back a little bit against Trump, he's getting a little juice politically. So are some of these other governments. That actually might be good for us in the long run. Certainly good for them. On the Ukraine question, on kind of the hard power question, it's a little crazy that the Europeans are talking about an independent plan to bolster Ukraine. That's not really plausible in the near term, unless they're going to like instantly buy some American weapons and ship them very quickly to Ukraine. There's really not much they can do. They can talk about being a bridge from the currently halted U.S. aid to Ukraine, from there to a presumed peace deal or ceasefire deal with Russia. That might be a good thing. In the long run, more European investment in defense spending is very welcome. There's a lot of talk today of Europe needing its own nuclear shield and that kind of thing, and there's some sort of breach with the United States. I think a lot of that, not entirely, but a lot of it is an overreaction to Trump's bluster and negotiating position and that kind of thing. In the long run, I think this will be good for NATO. It's not without some risk, but I think in the long run, it's good. And we'll actually, 5 years now, 10 years from now, we could actually see a stronger alliance.
I do want to quickly, we didn't touch on it, but you mentioned it, Martha, the cutoff of intel and, our Five Eyes alliance and maybe, the potential weaponization of that. We haven't seen that before. It's not been a topic that's come on fault lines, but whether those capabilities are used as leverage moving forward by the Trump administration is also something I think to watch out for.
And might they use it with regard to us is another question. And what does it mean for the Five Eyes? Does it become one pair of eyes?
Get your contacts on, folks. Get your contacts on.
Get your eyes checked.
I have 4 eyes. 4 eyes, 2 eyes.
Yeah, well, I think, it can easily be said that this is a stress test for NATO. I think arguably a stress test for the EU. I think it'll be difficult for the EU to have a consolidated path forward with Hungary in the mix. And, if they're talking about some sort of, coalition of the willing that's, not the EU and not NATO, that could be, a very interesting, a very interesting option. Well, on that note, that is a wrap. Thank you to Kelly Crowley, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for helping produce today's episode. Join us on Monday, March 10th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Follow us on YouTube and check out our video. Thank you so much.